All right, everyone. Today we're diving into a topic that's at the core of how the world functions economically, global production. Now, we're all aware that economic production is really the backbone of any economy, right? At its simplest, it's the process that turns inputs, like raw materials or labor, and services that have higher value. But here's where it gets interesting. It's not just about turning coal into energy or steel into cars. It's also deeply connected to our everyday lives, shaping both what we do for work and how we live. Think about it, whether you're working a paid job or even doing unpaid caregiving or volunteering, you're contributing to economic production. And the consequences of that work, whether it's for a paycheck or not, have a huge impact on our quality of life. But it doesn't stop there. This chapter also emphasizes something very important. Global production isn't just about economics. It's shaped by who holds power, how countries or corporations rearrange production, and the strategic decisions they make about what gets produced, where, and by whom. You see this especially when global trade is involved. Take a look at the map on this slide. It's a snapshot of the global sugar trade from 2010. The arrows show the flow of sugar between countries and regions. This flow isn't random. It's carefully structured by trade agreements, production costs, and even political alliances. For instance, you'll notice that some countries primarily export sugar, while others, especially wealthier ones, import large quantities. It's not just economic factors, but also power dynamics in global trade. So why does this matter? Well, these production patterns determine who benefits and who doesn't in the global economy. Countries that control the production or flow of certain key resources, like sugar, oil, or even labor, tend to have a lot more economic leverage, while others may find themselves reliant on imports and struggling to compete. In this chapter, we'll explore the deeper political side of global production, how these patterns of trade are shaped, who holds the power, and most importantly, what the consequences are for the world's distribution. It's not just about who grows sugar, but about who profits from it and who doesn't. All right, that's our quick overview. Keep these ideas in mind as we go deeper into the political and economic structures behind global. All right, let's move on to discuss one of the most influential and at times controversial systems of production, capitalism. Now, when we talk about capitalist production, what comes to mind? For most people, it's economic growth, wealth, and higher living standards. And that's not wrong. Have indeed driven immense prosperity in many parts of the world. They rely on investment and accumulation as the core drivers of growth, and that's helped many societies achieve higher standards of living. But here's the other side of the coin. Capitalism is often criticized for its exploitation of labor. There's a widespread feeling that individuals in capitalist systems can become alienated from more meaningful or rewarding activities, stuck in jobs that don't necessarily bring personal fulfillment. Not only that, but capitalism is linked to social issues like poverty, inequality, and destruction. These negative consequences can't be ignored when we discuss this system. So what are the key features of capitalist production? Well, the system is grounded in a couple of big ideas. First, private property is sacrosanct, protected by extensive legal frameworks. And second, markets play a central role and resources are allocated. In a capitalist system, prices are set by supply and demand, and production is largely driven by what the market wants. But it's not just about short-term gains. Capitalist economies rely on cumulative investment. Businesses and governments reinvest profits into more productive ventures, leading to what we call inflation. This process fuels even more growth in output over time, creating a cycle of economic expansion. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about globalization. In recent decades, capitalism hasn't just stayed confined within national borders. It's gone global, and with that globalization comes a lot, especially around how global production is organized. We now see multinational corporations operating in multiple countries, often seeking out cheaper labor or more favorable economic conditions. This global spread of capitalism has raised social and economic questions, particularly around the developing countries. Are these poorer countries benefiting from global capitalism, or are they being exploited? That's an ongoing debate that doesn't have easy answers, but it's essential to think about as we continue discussing global production. So, in a nutshell, capitalist systems have protected the world, bringing prosperity, but also significant social and environmental challenges. As we continue, we'll explore how these dynamics play out in both local and global contexts. Let's take a look at some of the key trends in global production that have been shaping the world economy over the past few decades. These trends show us not just where production is happening, but how it's being organized and structured globally. First up, we have growth within transnational corporations. Now, if you think about it, much of this still happens within private companies. These transnational corporations, think of giants like Apple or Toyota, have their own internal systems that control production and related processes. As the slide mentions, the significance of these corporations has expanded significantly, growing much trade or income. And essentially, these companies are global powerhouses. They don't just make products, they control vast networks of production that span continents. Take a look at the map on the left. It shows that countries like China, the US, and Germany dominate the world's manufacturing output, largely through the power of these corporations. China alone is responsible for over $4 trillion of output, making it the largest player in global manufacturing. Next, we have growth within global supply chains. Since the 1980s, we've seen a major shift in how companies structure their production. Back in the day, a lot of firms were they kept everything in-house, from raw materials to final production. But that's changed. Today, more and more companies are externalizing parts of their production, meaning they rely on a vast network of suppliers and contractors to handle different steps in the process. For example, many manufacture all their own parts. They outsource components from suppliers around the globe. So a car assembled in the US might have parts from Mexico, Japan, and Germany. This shift has created global supply chains that are incredibly complex and interdependent, but also vulnerable to disruptions during the COVID-19 pandemic. Lastly, we have the rise of new geographies of production. As the slide notes, production in manufacturing sectors has shifted decisively away from industrialized core economies. What this means is that production is no longer just concentrated in historically industrialized Europe or North America. Instead, it's spreading out to other parts of the world, particularly East Asia. China, in particular, has emerged as the workshop of the world, as the slide says. This shift is also driven by a process called clustering, where production networks concentrate in specific regions for efficiency. Entire industries might cluster in one area to benefit from lower costs and faster production. China, with its massive manufacturing base, is a prime example of this. So, to sum up, global production today is shaped by these three major trends: the dominance of transnational corporations, the supply chains, and the geographic shift of manufacturing to new regions, especially East Asia. All of these factors are interconnected and continue to transform how goods are produced and traded worldwide. Now that we've covered the economic trends driving global production, let's shift focus to the political drivers, because, as we know, politics plays a crucial role in shaping how and where production happens around the world. First, let's talk about the international policy environment. Over the past few significant push towards trade and investment liberalization, as the slide points out, this has created a favorable environment for global production strategies. What does this mean in practical terms? It means countries have signed bilateral, regional, and multilateral trade agreements that make it easier for goods and capital to flow across borders. These treaties don't just reduce tariffs or trade barriers, they also provide legal protection for businesses, making it safer for companies to invest abroad. Next, we have national policy changes. Many individual countries have taken steps to reform their economic policies in ways for foreign investment. The slide highlights some of these reforms, like enhanced tax incentives for foreign investors and the liberalization of shipping and transport markets. Countries are essentially competing with each other to become more attractive locations for global production by opening up their economies and offering conditions to foreign companies. One big example is how countries liberalize their financial sectors, which makes it easier for cross-border transactions to happen. This has been critical for global supply chains, where money, goods, and services need to move quickly and efficiently. Government promotion is another key driver. And national governments actively promote global production as a way to fuel industrial development and boost national competitiveness. Some governments establish export processing zones, offering attractive regulatory and tax policies to draw in foreign companies. By providing these benefits, governments aim to create economic growth and solidify their place in the global economy. Finally, we have foreign government support. In some cases, governments actively support the offshoring of production to other countries. The slide points out that this often happens for political reasons. For example, a government might move production overseas to bolster diplomatic or business ties with other countries. This kind of support often comes with long-term strategic benefits, not just economic ones. If you look at the image of the agreement signing ceremony on the slide, it's a great example of how these work in practice. Agreements like this one are often backed by government initiatives designed to strengthen international cooperation and encourage investment across borders. So, to summarize, the political drivers of global production, from international trade policies to national incentive motion, are just as important as the economic factors we've already discussed. They set the stage for where, how, and why companies decide to produce goods globally. Now that we've looked at the political drivers behind global production, let's shift our focus to the economic consequences that come from these global production systems. As we explore these, remember that not all impacts are equal across the board. There are winners and losers depending on how countries and workers fit in. First, let's discuss income distribution. One of the biggest consequences of global production arrangements is the way income is distributed. As the slide mentions, some groups, like certain workers, firms, or countries, benefit from new income earning opportunities. However, not everyone is so lucky. Some face stagnant exclusion from these opportunities altogether. You can see this imbalance play out on the chart on the left, which tracks the share of national income held by the top 10% across different regions. It's clear that inequality has been growing, especially in regions like the Middle East and India, where the top earners share of the wealth. This brings us to our next point, global income inequality. New patterns of global production have been closely linked to rising global inequality. The slide notes that some low-income countries have successfully integrated into global production systems, benefiting from economic growth, but many others remain. This creates a widening gap between those that have access to the global market and those that don't. For example, countries in sub-Saharan Africa have struggled to fully integrate, leading to slower income growth compared to regions that are more deeply embedded in global supply chains. Then we have the workers and producers who do manage to participate in global production systems can often access new income streams and opportunities. However, not all roles within these systems are created equal. As the slide points out, those trapped in low value-added roles face limited chances for advancement. Workers who might be assembling products in factories but don't have pathways to move into higher paying or more skilled positions. This dynamic is particularly visible in sectors like garment production in parts of Asia, where workers can remain stuck in repetitive, low-wage jobs with little hope for career development. Finally, economic benefits. Countries that successfully integrate into global production can reap significant rewards. As the slide mentions, participation in these systems can lead to poverty reduction, employment creation, and even an increased capacity to import essential goods. Nations that can position themselves as key players in chains often experience sustained economic growth. China is a prime example of this. Its integration into global production networks has turned it into the world's factory, fueling decades of rapid economic expansion. To wrap up, The economic consequences of global production are complex and multifaceted. Workers, producers, and nations benefit from increased income opportunities. Others face exclusion or stagnation, and rising global income inequality remains a significant challenge. Understanding these dynamics is key to addressing the economic disparities we see. Let's continue to discuss how corporations wield power in global production, and it's a lot more complex than you might think. Let's break it down by looking at 4 key areas where corporate power comes into play. First, we have direct operational control. This is when companies exercise power directly in the countries where they operate. Corporations, large multinationals, have significant control over how production processes are managed in their host countries. This can include decisions about working conditions, labor practices, and production methods. Companies with direct operations in a country often have considerable influence over local markets and employment. A company setting up a factory in a developing country might dictate everything from the wage levels to the way work is organized on the factory floor. Next, there's indirect market influence. This is where things get interesting. Some companies don't need direct control over production to exert significant power. For example, Walmart or Amazon hold a huge amount of market power over their suppliers. They can influence prices, working conditions, and wages indirectly, simply by controlling the flow of contracts and setting tough conditions for suppliers. In these cases, it's not just about owning the factory, but about in the market. Suppliers often have to comply with the buyer's demands if they want to maintain business relationships. The third key point is supply chain governance. Companies often govern production through contracts, audits, and standards that extend far beyond their direct operations. This is particularly important when it relies on a complex global supply chain, with production scattered across multiple countries. They may not own the factories where goods are produced, but through contracts and regular audits, they set the rules on how goods are made. Think of it like this. While the production might be happening in a facility the corporation can still control what happens there by enforcing strict standards on quality, safety, or labor conditions. Lastly, we have limits to corporate power. While corporations do have significant influence, there are still limits to what they can control. As the slide mentions, complex and limited control over day-to-day management in supplier facilities can constrain their power. For example, a corporation might demand higher production standards, but they can't always oversee every detail of how these standards are implemented on the ground. This can be due to a variety of reasons, from cultural to management practices. Moreover, market forces like fluctuating prices, competition, and regulations can also limit corporate power in unexpected ways. So, to summarize, corporations exert their influence in global production through a combination of direct control, market leverage, and supply chain governance. But even with all this power, they face limitations due to the complexity of global markets and the challenges of managing operations that are often spread across multiple countries. It's a delicate balancing act between control and the reality of on-the-ground operations. Let's shift our attention to how governments and corporations interact within global production systems. While corporations wield significant power, governments also play a critical role in shaping the global economic landscape. However, as we'll see, the influence goes both ways. Corporations can also have a performance. First, let's talk about corporate influence on governments. As the slide notes, reorganized global production has given corporations new forms of social and political power, especially in their interactions with national and local governments. Multinational corporations, particularly those with vast resources, can significantly influence smaller economies. These smaller economies are often vulnerable to the financial strength and decision-making of these corporations. For example, if a corporation threatens to relocate its operations elsewhere, the local government might feel pressured to adjust policies or offer concessions. So, how do corporations exercise this influence? This brings us to the second point, methods of influence. Corporations have several tools at their disposal when it comes to influencing governments. One common approach is lobbying. By lobbying governments, companies can push for favorable policy in their operations. Another method is through trade negotiations. Many corporations actively participate in shaping trade agreements that impact their industries, often advocating for lower tariffs or fewer restrictions on the movement of goods. In addition, corporations use their ability to relocate production as leverage. To move their operations to another country, they can negotiate with governments, using their economic resources as bargaining chips. Essentially, the ability to shift production across borders gives corporations a lot of negotiating power, particularly in developing countries where jobs and investment are. The third point is sectoral differences. Corporate influence on governments is not uniform across all industries. The manufacturing sector, for instance, tends to focus on issues like labor protection and taxation. In these industries, companies often lobby for lower taxes or fewer regulations on labor to reduce costs and maximize profit. While in sectors like agriculture and mining, the focus might be on environmental protection and land rights. Here, companies may lobby governments to ease environmental regulations or grant access to land for resource extraction. Finally, government dependence on foreign firms can vary significantly between sectors. In some industries, especially heavily on foreign investment or technology, governments may be more dependent on multinational firms. This dependence can lead to situations where governments have less control over certain aspects of their economies, because they need to keep foreign firms happy to sustain growth and employment. In summary, while a key role in regulating global production, corporations, especially large multinationals, have significant power to influence government policies. This influence varies by sector and is often exercised through methods like lobbying, trade negotiations, and the threat of relocating production. Understanding this dynamic is essential to grasping the full picture of global production today. Let's now focus on how global production has been regulated traditionally. Historically, governments and international organizations have played key roles in establishing rules and standards that shape economic production across the globe. The first key point is national government responsibility. For much of history, responsibility for regulating economic production was seen as falling squarely on the shoulders of national governments. Governments had the power to set policies, enforce laws, and create regulations that impacted how production occurred within their borders. Whether it was setting tariffs, controlling labor laws, or enforcing environmental, it was the state that managed production and trade. However, as global trade expanded, it became clear that international coordination was also necessary. This leads us to the second point, international labor standards. While governments regulate their own economies, labor issues have often required a more international. This is where organizations like the International Labour Organization, ILO, come in. The ILO has long been a forum where countries work together to set labor standards. Its role is to ensure that workers' rights are protected globally, and it helps to establish minimum standards for working conditions that countries can adopt. For example, develop standards on issues such as child labor, working hours, and occupational health and safety. Moving on to the 1970s Intergovernmental Codes, this was a period when international organizations recognized the growing influence of multinational enterprises in global production. Two key initiatives came out of the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises and the ILO's Tripartite Declaration. These codes were adopted as frameworks to govern the activities of multinational companies, especially when operating across borders. The idea was to hold these corporations accountable and ensure that they adhere to standards, whether related to labor, the environment, or corporate governance. Finally, we arrive at recent international standards. Global regulation didn't stop with the 1970s. In recent decades, we've seen a continued push to develop international standards through agreements and initiatives. For example, the UN national corporations focus on how businesses should operate within the global economy, particularly concerning human rights and sustainability. Additionally, many trade agreements now include labor clauses, ensuring that trade partners adhere to basic labor rights. Then there's the Global Compact, an initiative that aims to adopt sustainable and socially responsible policies across the globe. In summary, While national governments historically held the primary responsibility for regulating economic production, international organizations have played an increasingly important role in setting standards, particularly from the ILO's labor standards to the OECD and UN initiatives. These frameworks help ensure that global production is not only economically efficient, but also ethically sound. Now, let's shift our attention to how private law is used to regulate corporations, particularly in global contexts. Unlike government regulations, which tend to be public and enforced by states, private law operates through courts and civil procedures. It provides an alternative way of holding corporations for their actions, both at home and abroad. First, we have extraterritorial prosecution. This is when a company can be prosecuted in its home country for harm caused by its subsidiaries in other countries. For example, if a company based in the U.S. is responsible for environmental damage caused by a factory it owns, it could be sued in the U.S. courts. This legal mechanism allows for some accountability, even when the actions occur beyond a company's domestic borders. One notable tool in the U.S. legal system is the Alien Tort Claims Act. This law, as the slide mentions, allows non-U.S. citizens to sue corporations and government officials in U.S. courts for human rights violations that occur abroad. The Alien Tort Claims Act has been used in cases involving environmental damage, labor rights abuses, and other serious violations of international law. While it has the potential to be its application can be limited, especially if the courts determine that the case doesn't meet certain criteria. Next, let's talk about unfair business practices. This refers to legal cases where corporations are held accountable for misleading advertising or unfair business conduct that impacts populations outside of their home country. Law allows individuals and organizations to bring lawsuits against corporations if they engage in deceptive practices that harm consumers or communities. For example, if a company makes false environmental claims in their advertising, they could face legal consequences under private law for However, as powerful as these tools may seem, there are significant limitations to the effectiveness of private law approaches. As the slide points out, while private law mechanisms are binding in theory, they are often stretched beyond their original purpose when used to regulate transnational business. In practice, it's rare to result in successful legal rulings. Companies often have deep legal resources and can prolong cases for years, making it difficult for plaintiffs, especially individuals or smaller entities, to win. Additionally, the complexities of international law and jurisdiction can hinder these efforts. In conclusion, private law approaches like extraterritorial prosecution, the Alien Tort Claims Act, and cases related to unfair business practices offer important tools for regulating corporate behavior. They are often limited in scope and effectiveness. These approaches are a vital landscape, but they face challenges in holding corporations fully accountable for their actions on a global scale. Now let's dive into the concept of supply chain governance and how it has emerged as a crucial aspect of global production. Over time, companies, governments, and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, have developed different approaches to ensure that supply chains are managed in a way that aligns with environmental and labor standards. This shift has been driven by a need for accountability in an increasingly globalized economy. First, let's look at internal corporate reforms. Many companies have realized that they can't manage global supply chains without reforming their own internal processes. As the slide highlights, companies are and units that focus specifically on compliance with social norms. This could mean setting up departments dedicated to corporate social responsibility or hiring compliance officers who ensure that the company is adhering to ethical labor practices. These internal reforms reflect a growing recognition that companies have responsibility for what happens, not just in their own operations, but throughout their entire supply chain. Next, we have supplier contracts. Contracts between buyers and suppliers have evolved to include more than just price and delivery terms. Now, many contracts incorporate obligations related to labor standards and abilities. For example, A corporation might require its suppliers to ensure safe working conditions, prohibit child labor, or comply with environmental standards. By embedding these expectations directly into contracts, companies can hold their suppliers accountable for maintaining ethical practices. Another development is the rise of multi-stakeholder schemes. These are partnerships that bring together businesses, governments, and NGOs to create standards, conduct audits, and build capacity. These schemes help ensure that supply chains are governed not just by corporate interests, but by broader concerns about human rights. One example of this is the Fair Trade movement, where businesses, governments, and NGOs work together to set standards that ensure workers in developing countries are paid fairly and operate under safe conditions. This collaborative approach allows for a more comprehensive governance structure that benefits all parties. Finally, there are private regulatory standards. Over the past few decades, corporate and NGO-driven initiatives have led to the creation of private regulatory frameworks that govern transnational production. These standards are enforced through private certification systems, meaning companies or third-party organizations suppliers to ensure they comply with established norms. Think of certifications like ISO standards or fair trade labels. These are often used by companies to signal that their supply chains meet certain ethical, social, or environmental standards. In conclusion, the emergence of supply chain reflects a broader shift in how global production is managed. Through internal corporate reforms, supplier contracts, multi-stakeholder schemes, and private regulatory standards, businesses are increasingly focused on ensuring that their supply chains operate ethically and sustainably. These governance mechanisms not only protect workers and the environment, but also help companies manage risks and build trust with consumers and investors. Now that we've discussed the emergence of supply chain governance, let's look at some concrete examples of supply chain governance initiatives. These initiatives help ensure that companies and industries adhere to ethical, social, and environmental standards throughout their supply chains. First, we have multi-stakeholder schemes, initiatives that involve a variety of stakeholders, including businesses, governments, and NGOs. They work together to set standards and enforce ethical practices in global supply chains. Examples include the Fair Labor Association, FLA, SA 8000, and the Ethical Trading Initiative, ETI, often focus on ensuring decent working conditions and fair wages, especially in industries like apparel, where labor exploitation can be a major issue. Through audits and certifications, these schemes help businesses demonstrate that they are operating ethically. Next are corporate codes of conduct. These are guidelines companies set for their suppliers and partners. They are especially common in industries like garments and footwear, where large corporations such as Nike or H&M establish codes of conduct that outline expectations for labor practices, safety standards, and environmental impact. These are for companies to ensure that their suppliers are adhering to certain ethical standards, even if they are operating in countries with weaker regulations. Then we have industry-level codes, which are collective standards set by entire industries. These codes often aim to tackle specific challenges within a given sector. The Bangladesh Garments Manufacturers and Exporters Association has created standards aimed at improving working conditions in the country's massive garment industry. Similarly, the Kenya Flour Council Code regulates labor conditions and environmental practices in Kenya's flour industry, which is a major. Other examples include the British Toy and Hobby Association Code and the Responsible Care Initiative for the chemical industry. These industry-wide codes help align all businesses within a sector to common ethical and operational standards. Lastly, we have fair trade initiatives. These initiatives are designed to address the distribution that often exists within global production systems. Fair trade ensures that producers, especially small farmers or workers in developing countries, receive fair prices for their products and labor. This is critical in sectors like coffee, cocoa, and handicrafts, where producers often face significant losses. Fair trade certification helps to create more equitable economic relationships by ensuring that a greater share of the profits goes to the producers themselves, rather than just to large corporations. To wrap up, these supply chain governance initiatives, whether through multi-stakeholder schemes, codes of conduct, industry-level codes, or fair trade initiatives, are all essential tools in promoting ethical and sustainable practices within global supply chains. They help protect workers, ensure fair wages, and promote environmental sustainability across various. As supply chains become more complex and global, they are also becoming more politicized, leading to the rise of what we can call new supply chain politics. This shift has several important implications for how global production is governed and regulated. First, let's talk about direct politicization. As the slide points, many of these new initiatives reflect a politicization of global production activity. What this means is that supply chains are no longer just about economic efficiency or cost management. They are becoming politically charged issues. We see this in areas like climate change, labor rights, and human rights. Chains are at the heart of debates about ethical production. Protests, consumer movements, and advocacy campaigns are all examples of how political movements are pushing for greater accountability in global production systems. Next is hardwiring regulation. Regulatory arrangements are increasingly being hardwired in market-oriented institutions that govern global production. This means that regulations are becoming an integral part of how businesses operate. For instance, many companies now embed labor and environmental standards directly into their supply chain operations, making them part of the day-to-day functioning of global. These regulations aren't just imposed by governments. They are increasingly driven by private governance systems and industry standards, often enforced through third-party audits and certifications. The third point is the reconfiguration of governance. These changes are leading to a broader reconfiguration of global governance beyond state-centered political institutions. In other words, global governance is no longer just about what nation-states decide in trade agreements or international treaties. Now, corporations, NGOs, and multi-stakeholder initiatives are playing a central role in regulating global production. This shift marks a traditional model of governance and signals the rise of a more networked, multi-actor system, where both public and private players shape the rules of global trade. Lastly, we have the ongoing challenges. Despite the progress made in regulating supply chains through private governance schemes, there are still challenges. These schemes often suffer from limited coverage, meaning they don't extend to all sectors or regions. There's also the problem of weak enforcement. Many governance initiatives lack the power to enforce compliance effectively. Additionally, questions of accountability remain unresolved, especially when it comes to communities affected by global production. Who holds companies accountable when these governance mechanisms fail? And how can workers in developing countries have a voice in the governance structures that impact their lives? In conclusion, the new supply chain politics shaping global production in significant ways, from the direct politicization of production activities to the reconfiguration of governance and the hardwiring of regulation into business practices. These trends are creating both opportunities and challenges. As we move forward to address the ongoing challenges of coverage, enforcement, and accountability will be critical to ensuring that supply chain governance works for everyone. As you explore the first essay question, you could focus on how the globalization of production has altered the landscape of economic and social inequalities between developed and developing countries. Think about how industries have shifted to low-cost regions, and how multinational companies play a role in dynamics. Look into political factors like trade agreements or government policies that either encourage or restrict these shifts, and the economic forces such as wage gaps, access to resources, or technological advancements that drive these changes. As you dive into the literature and case studies of specific countries or sectors, this will help you develop a deeper understanding of not just the broader patterns, but also the complexities and real-world impacts of these shifts. By the end, you'll have the expertise to explain how these forces are reshaping global inequalities today. In exploring this, focus on the significant role that transnational corporations, TNCs, play in shaping the global supply chain. Consider how their immense reach and influence affect the sourcing of materials, manufacturing processes, and distribution of goods across borders. Think about the strategic TNCs make, such as where to locate factories, how to manage supply chains efficiently, and how these decisions can have both positive and negative impacts on labor conditions. Especially in developing regions, pay attention to how these strategies can lead to unequal income distribution, where certain regions benefit from technological advancements, while others might face exploitative working conditions and minimal wage growth. As you research the literature, focus on case studies and empirical data that highlight the real-world impacts of these strategies so you can understand the broader implications of TNC's roles, markets, and income equality. By the end, you'll have the tools to critically analyze how these corporations drive both global growth and inequality. As for the third question, I want you to examine how various governments, international organizations, and non-governmental actors have responded to the challenge of production. Start by looking at the ways governments have implemented or adapted labor standards and environmental regulations in response to the pressures of globalization. Some countries might enforce stricter regulations to protect workers' rights and the environment, while others may weaken standards to attract foreign international corporations. Consider the role of international agreements and organizations, such as the International Labour Organization, ILO, or environmental accords like the Paris Agreement, which aim to set global standards. Also, explore how non-governmental organizations, NGOs, groups have put pressure on both corporations and governments to improve labor conditions and environmental practices, using tools like public campaigns, certifications, and consumer advocacy. Through your literature review, I encourage you to look into both the successes and limitations of these responses. Pay attention to highlight how certain countries or regions have effectively managed the balance between economic growth, labor rights, and environmental protection, and others where these responses have been insufficient or undermined. This will give you a well-rounded understanding of the complex and often conflicting interests involved in regulation. Choose only one out of the 3 essay questions and make yourself the expert of the selected question. The due day for this task is Wednesday night. Bye for now. Have a week of good learning experience.